The Soviet Union was a monstrous formation on the planet's body, and very few wished to live in such freedom, equality, and brotherhood. For the sake of getting away from the rat monster, people were literally going to do mad things. Things that most people could barely imagine and even saw only in adventure movies. But as they say, life is the best director. It is about such escapes that we will talk about today. And we will start with pilot Viktor Balenko. On the 6th of September 1976, a routine training flight was taking place at the Chuguivka air base in the Primorsky Krai of Russia. There were training pilots on the fighter jets. Suddenly, one of them, a MiG-25 with tail number 31, veered sharply off course and disappeared from the radar screens. The flight director decided that there had been an accident, ordered a search operation, but the reality was far simpler though. After a while, the rescue operations had to be stopped at 9:15 a.m., 2 hours and 30 minutes after the disappearance. Japanese radio broadcasts an emergency message. A Soviet plane piloted by Senior Lieutenant Viktor Balenko of the USSR Air Force and landed at Hakodate Airport on the Hokkaido island. The pilot asked for political asylum in the United States of America. This was a loud slap to the face of Moscow. Not just any dissident, but a communist, a Soviet army officer escaped. And not only escaped, but he escaped on a top secret plane that had recently been put into service. After Balenko's landing, a huge scandal erupted in Japan. The Soviets blamed Japan for the kidnapping and retention of their pilot and demanded the return of both the pilot and the plane. On top of that, Soviet fighter jets were flying around Japan, allegedly scaring Japan. On the other hand, the Japanese were afraid to approach the plane in the first days after the MiG landing, as they did not exclude the possibility that the Soviets would want to destroy the plane, but the rats understood that such a decision would lead to war, so they decided to switch on diplomatic pressure and propaganda. A representative of the Union embassy called the pilot a betrayer and said that sooner or later the Union would return the pilot to his so-called homeland. On 1st October 1976, at the meeting with President Ford in the Oval Office, then Union Foreign Minister Gromyko raised the issue of the reparation of the Soviet pilot, but Ford pointed out that this matter was now exclusively the responsibility of the US government, as the pilot had voluntarily applied for political asylum. By the way, an interesting fact that after landing at the civilian airport in Japan, the MiG-25 had as such as 30 seconds of fuel left. If fortune smiles, it smiles on the brave and decisive. Even now, Russians are receiving similar slaps in the face. Here's a vivid example of the Russian helicopter landing in Poltava. Moreover, the pilot had sent his family to Ukraine in advance, and then he himself arrived in Ukraine by helicopter. A pretty powerful slap, isn't it? But let's go back to 1976. The official authorities of the Soviet Union tried to get the fugitive extradited, but on the 9th of September, Balenko was transported to the USA, where he soon obtained citizenship. The plane itself was thoroughly examined by American and Japanese experts. The plane was soon returned to its owner for a compensation of $11 million, since the MiG had been dismantled. As a reminder, 11 million at that time is now about 40 million. Moreover, it should be borne in mind that the Americans knew virtually nothing about the MiG-25 before that, and this caused them understandable fear. According to the press at that time, American and Japanese experts praised the engines but called all the electronics yesterday's aviation. This trend continues until today in Russia, but the degradation now involves not only electronics but also mechanics. To prevent further escapes, the USSR military command issued an instruction forbidding border intercepted interceptors in the Far East to fully refuel their tanks so they could not reach Japan. This is a banal realization of its insignificance as a state entity, but it is also worth looking at the details. So before his escape, Belenko was an exemplary officer, a working class man, a silver medalist at school. He was also a member of the Communist Party. He worked at a factory before joining the Air Force, so he was a super exemplary civilian and communist. He had a highly successful career
with a paycheck of 300 rubles,
which was very good money, a young wife and a little son. It was everything most Soviet citizens dreamed of. So, what prompted him to escape? He gave the answer himself in an interview. As a child, he saw how different real life was from what was shown on TV. These doubts only intensified at the flight school. The public speech of a black representative of the US Communist Party was a revelation for him. So he asked himself a logical question. Who was democracy if there is only one party and leader in the Union, and communists in the USA are free to speak out? Another very good reason for this decision was in 1975. Because of a dispute with the head of the flight school, Major General Kolodnikov, Belenko was checked in a psychiatric hospital, which did not require an examination, but the general's word was enough. All this was compounded by family problems. His wife was already threatening to divorce him, and in the summer of 1976, she said that in October she would go to her parents with her son, and that she had no desire to see Victor anymore. His mother abandoned him at the age of 2, and he hasn't seen his father since the late 60s. And to understand whether Belenko regretted starting a new life in the US, there is a clear answer. Once he bought some canned meat and fried it for dinner. He ate it, but later he found out that it wasn't canned meat, it was a cat food. Moreover, he noted that the food for animals in the USA tasted better than the canned food for people in the USSR. The information about his fate varies. According to some sources, he died in 2006 of a heart attack, while others say he got a divorce and is still alive. Moving on to an equally interesting case of escape, but not from Shashwank but from the Soviet Union, and consider the fact that this time we are talking about an 18-year-old girl. Liliana Gasin lived in Odessa. How she managed to get a job as a waitress on the Leonid Sobenov cruise ship at such a young age is a mystery. As they say, you will not leave fate. But she didn't stay there for long. On January 14, 1977, during a stopover in Sydney, Liliana climbed out the window and 40 minutes later reached the coveted Australian shore. The story never lost its spy flavor. Dressed only in a red bikini, the girl asked the first Australian she met in broken English to help her with clothes and shelter. The Soviet embassy raised the alarm in time and almost found Liliana, but reporters from the Daily Mirror were quicker. They managed to hide the runaway in exchange for an exclusive interview and a photo in a red swimsuit. We can only imagine what could have happened to her if the Soviets had captured her, and in this case everything would have been clear about her moral.
Gasinskaya's fate turned out to be happy. Despite the efforts of the Soviet embassy to extradite her, she was granted political asylum in Australia. She worked as a model, got married and divorced. She now lives in London. Life is quite unpredictable. The next escape from the clutches of the Red Monster speaks volumes about character and what a person is willing to do for freedom. Now let's talk about 25-year-old Latvian Diana Palena. On April 10, 1970, a Soviet fishing vessel sent a distress call to the United States Coast Guard. A young waitress was dying on board 170 kilometers from New York City. When the rescue helicopter reached the ship, she was unconscious. Once Diana was taken to the hospital and the doctors did their job, it turned out that the poisoning was not accidental. She has deliberately taken a huge dose of medication just to be taken off the ship and transported to the American shore. This was the only way she could escape the USSR. How much should a person adore freedom and how much should they hate the Soviet Union? This is a good example for good Russians. By the way, of what it means to hate the regime, if speaking of the regime and not sitting somewhere in France for years, having previously worked quite successfully in Russia, for example as a lawyer. So let's get back to dear Diana. There were Soviet diplomats on duty outside her ward for 10 days, trying to persuade her to return to her homeland. But Diana Palena was able to establish contacts with the Latvian diaspora, and her fellow compatriots helped her apply to the immigration authorities for political asylum. We think each and every one of us would have done the same in her place.
She received her refugee status 18 days later, and soon afterwards she was granted American citizenship. There is no information about Diana's fate. She is lost somewhere in the vastness of the great country of which she had dreamed so much. Stanislav Korolov. Some say that this escape is the craziest, wildest and bravest. His childhood dream was about the sea. He wanted to explore the whole world and discover all the seas and oceans. But in the USSR, oceanographer Stanislav Korolov was not allowed to travel abroad or leave the country. So he decided to leave the USSR on his own without asking anyone's permission. You would agree that this was an extremely bold decision and further steps, given that the Union was a solid prison and a killing machine, just like Russia is now. Though Russia is now a killing machine primary for its neighbors, but that's a whole other story. After seeing an advert for a liner that sailed from Vladivostok to the equator and therefore did not require an exit visa, Korolov planned one of the most high-profile escapes from the communist regime. Stanislav bought a ticket and boarded a ship. The Soviet Union left Vladivostok on December 8th. On the night of the 13th, about 100 kilometers from the Philippine island of Siargao, Korolov jumped into the water without any supplies or rescue equipment. 2 days later, in a semi-conscious state, he reached that desired shore. Here are few more details. Wearing fins, a mask and a snorkel, Stanislav Korolov jumped from the 14-meter deck of the ship. By a miracle, he managed to stay alive and avoid getting caught in the ship's propeller, and had 18 kilometers to go to the shore. It was quite an achievable task for an experienced swimmer, but then everything went wrong. It turned out that Korolov had miscalculated the distance to the shore on the map and had not considered the current that was carrying him in the opposite direction. It was only after 3 days and 2 nights without food, water and sleep, here the yoga had been practicing came in handy, that the scientists stepped onto the life-saving shore of the Philippine island of Siargao. The plankton had completely covered his body by then, so Stanislav literally gloved in the dark. Just one another great example of how to achieve your dreams. He could have easily died, but he went all the way and thus did the unimaginable. He was deported to Canada after an investigation by the Philippine authorities, where he obtained citizenship. At first he worked in a pizzeria, then started doing machine research. He traveled all over the world, visiting the Hawaiian Islands, the Arctic and the equator. Korolov was convinced in the absentia in the USSR, 10 years in prison for treason against the homeland, but we believe Stanislav did not hear about that verdict. After his marriage he moved to Israel, where he worked at the Oceanographic Institute. He tragically died on January 29 in 1988 during diving operations while freeing scientific equipment from fishing nets. He did not notice that the cylinders were out of air. He was buried in Israel, sadly, but this story is truly inspiring. After Stanislav's death, his wife published a book called Alone in the Ocean, which based on the scientist's diaries and memories described his feelings during his escape from the USSR. So, was it so good in the Soviet Union that people jumped off the deck and were ready to swim across the ocean in search of hellish capitalism? It's
It's a rhetorical question. In 2017, inspired by his feat, the Ukrainian band Antitila created a music video for TDME as a short story of the scientist's escape. Now comes the bloody and dramatic story of the escape of Algirdas and Pranas Brazinskas, father and son who made history not only for their escape but also for the first successful aircraft theft in the history of the USSR. Unfortunately, the story of their escape was drenched in blood. Pranas Brazinskas shot a flight attendant. On October 15th in 1970, armed with a grenade, a gun and a knife, Pranas and his underage son Algirdas hijacked an AN-24 aircraft flying from Batumi to Sukhumi. In other words, it was a hostage taking, but their actions can also be understood except the murder of the flight attendant, which we believe was unnecessary. There were 46 passengers on board. Shortly after takeoff, the Brazinskases tried to pass a note of demand to the pilots through the flight attendant, 19-year-old Nadia Kurchenko, but she immediately raised the alarm and was shot dead by Pranas. In fact, the hijacking of the aircraft was quite bloody. The aircraft commander, navigator and flight engineer were also injured. The co-pilot managed to land the plane in Turkey, where the Brazinskases surrendered to the police. In other words, they achieved their goal. The Turkish authorities refused to extradite the escapes. Pranas Brazinskas was sentenced to 8 years in prison and his son to 2. The hijacking of the plane was declared forced and the further actions of the escapes were deemed unintentional. 4 years later, the father was granted amnesty and both escapes moved to the United States of America. But the story doesn't end there. In 2002, the son killed his father and was sent to prison, and this time in the US for 16 years. Quite a sad story, but this is karma at work. After these events, hijacking became a very popular way to escape. There were other escapes, some successful and some not. The escape was made by artists and athletes. It was easier for them. They literally vanished during tours or competitions in foreign cities. This is how ballet dancer Mikhail Parishnikov, chess player Igor Ivanov, hockey player Alexander Mogilny, and film director Oleg Vidov escaped. Some KGB agents such as Oleg Lydian, Vitaly Yurchenko and Oleg Gordievsky escaped as well. These people had the opportunity to leave the country. However, there were those who couldn't quit the communist paradise, and desperation forced them to deep end. During their escapes, people died, often innocents, and they themselves died. Some managed to escape abroad, like ethnic Germans Vitaly and Boris Schmidt and Arthur Schuller, who in 1982 hijacked a plane and fled to Turkey, injuring 2 crew members, and some did not. A striking example in the Ovechkin family, who also hijacked a plane in 1988. As a result, 9 people died and 10 were injured. So many tragedies, death, grief, and all this because of a terrible entity that people in Russia are so hungry to return. And our mission is to prevent this from happening in our land. We will win. Share our videos, subscribe to our channel, give us thumbs up and write comments. Support us financially if desired. All the details are in the description box below.